Let's talk about something that pretty much everyone feels from time to time. This nagging sense that the world is, well, losing its moral compass. But is that feeling actually based in reality? We're going to dig in and see what the data really tells us.
I mean, really think about it for a second. You turn on the news, you're scrolling through social media, and it is so easy to feel like things like honesty, kindness, and just basic integrity are going extinct. It's a really powerful, and for a lot of us, a pretty worrying feeling.
And look, if you feel this way, you are so not alone. Not by a long shot. Gallup has been polling this for years, and they found that a record number of Americans now rate the state of moral values as poor. So this isn't just some vague hunch people have, it's a huge, widespread perception that something is fundamentally broken. Okay, so let's start by just unpacking this feeling itself. How deep does it run, and how long has it been around? You know what's really wild is that this isn't some new 21st century thing. A massive study in the journal Nature found that for at least the last 70 years, people in over 60 countries, all across the globe, have consistently felt that morality was better in the past. It's this persistent feeling that just refuses to go away. But what if this feeling, as universal and persistent as it is, isn't actually reflecting reality? What if it's a powerful illusion? A trick our own minds are playing on us. So, the first piece of this puzzle is something called biased exposure, or the negativity bias. Basically, our brains are hardwired to notice and remember bad news more than good news. It's an old survival mechanism. And of course, the 24/7 news cycle knows this and just pours gasoline on that fire, feeding us a constant diet of crisis and conflict. It gives us this totally skewed picture that bad behavior is way more common than it actually is. And then there's the second piece of the trick. Biased memory. You've probably heard it called rosy retrospection. Just think about your own past. Our minds have this funny little feature where the pain from negative memories fades a lot faster than the warm glow from the positive ones. And what that does is it systematically makes the past seem better, safer, and yeah, more moral than it probably was. So here's the kicker. When you slam these two biases together, you get what researchers have dubbed the great moral illusion. Our nonstop diet of negative news makes the present feel like this moral wasteland. Meanwhile, our selective rosy memory paints the past as a moral wonderland. And when you compare that wasteland to that wonderland, well, of course, it looks like there's been a massive decline. But here's the thing. The objective evidence, the actual data, it just doesn't back this up. Things aren't getting worse. Truly awful behaviors have declined dramatically over the centuries. When you ask people to rate the morality of their peers, those ratings have been pretty stable for decades. And here's the real clincher. When you ask people about the folks they actually know, their friends, their family, their colleagues, they don't report a decline. They report moral improvement. Okay, so if society-wide morality isn't actually collapsing, does that mean we're off the hook? Everything's fine? Well, not exactly. The real problem seems to be a lot more specific, and it's happening right at the top. We're facing a very real crisis in ethical leadership. This quote from a recent Fortune survey just hits the nail on the head. At the exact moment the public is demanding more integrity, more ethics from our leaders, the number of CEOs we're actually seen as highly moral, is shrinking. There's this huge gap between what we want and what we're actually getting. So why is this happening? Well, the research points to a pretty toxic mix of factors. The biggest piece of the pie is a simple lack of accountability, a system where the consequences for doing the wrong thing are just too weak. Right behind that is the crushing pressure to deliver short-term results, which makes it really easy to push ethics to the side. And the final piece? Good old-fashioned self-interest, with leaders just looking out for themselves. Now, this decline in ethics at the top, it's not usually an accident. It's often the result of very specific, deliberate behaviors. So let's take a look at the playbook that manipulative leaders use to basically rot an organization's moral core from the inside out. These tactics might feel a little too familiar because they work together like a system. First, leaders start rewarding results at any cost, which sends a crystal clear message that integrity doesn't really matter. That creates a culture of fear where nobody wants to speak up. Then they start to divide and conquer, pitting teams and people against each other. All the while, they're practicing moral hypocrisy, saying one thing and doing another, and just waving it all away as necessary for innovation. In fact, business ethics professor Marianne Jennings identified a super clear pattern for this. She calls it the 7 signs of ethical collapse. And as you can see, it's like a row of dominoes. It all starts with that intense pressure to hit the numbers. That leads to fear and silence. And that's often enabled by a larger-than-life CEO whose word is law, usually because the board is too weak to challenge them. Before you know it, conflicts of interest are just normal, and cutting corners gets rebranded as innovation. It's a step-by-step roadmap to total disaster.
All right, so that's the problem, and it's a big one. But this isn't hopeless. So how do we fight back? How do we actually start building cultures where ethics aren't just a poster on the wall, but can actually thrive? The change really has to happen on 2 different fronts. For us as individuals, it's about looking in the mirror. It's about cultivating the self-awareness to see our own biases and practicing the empathy to understand how we affect other people. And for the institutions, the responsibility is huge. Leaders have to do more than just talk about integrity. They have to live it. They have to build transparency and prove that long-term value is way more important than the next quarterly report. So this gives us a pretty clear, actionable roadmap. Step 1, it has to start at the top, with leaders who genuinely lead by example. From there, you build psychological safety. You create a culture where speaking up is actually rewarded, not punished. Then you offer real education, giving people the frameworks they need to handle those tough gray areas. And finally, you have to install real checks and balances, spreading power out so that no single person is above the rules. So the big takeaway is this. Our feeling that society is in some kind of broad moral freefall, it's most likely an illusion, a trick of the mind. But that crisis we're seeing in ethical leadership, that is very, very real. The good news is that ethical cultures aren't an accident. They can be built intentionally. They are a choice. And that really leaves all of us with a final question to think about. What role will you play in building them?